The primary purpose of any government, and especially the United States government, is supposed to be a couple of major things categorically: keep the population safe and keep them within the ability to have economic prosperity. I mean, that's pretty straightforward, right? The government's supposed to keep you safe and to give you a chance to make a living. I mean, those are the main issues that we have from any government, and so it should be self evident that that's the policies that they're going to do. You may disagree with them from time to time that this policy would be better than that policy, and that's why you have some of the political parties and all that kind of thing. But generally speaking, you still understand that that's what they're doing. But what happens when evidence is presented that shows maybe they're not doing that? Now, whether it's intentional or whether it's just incapacity, who can say? But we have a lot of evidence that our government right now is putting us at greater risk, and especially in our diplomats and our senior officials, putting us at greater risk of stumbling into wars instead of getting us out of them and keeping us safe. And there is no better person to break this down than with Professor John Mearsheimer, international relations theorist extraordinaire and political science professor at the University of Chicago, one of the favorites on our channel. John, welcome back to the show.
Glad to be here, Danny.
It's probably like a little bit of red meat to a bull or something to say, that what we're doing internationally is not making any sense to somebody with your reputation and credibility. But we have to address it here. And even before we get into some of the specifics here, my primary worry is that in both the Europe and in the Middle East is that our policies are taking problematic and difficult and chaotic situations, and instead of doing anything to make them better in either case, we seem to be doing the exact opposite. How do you see it?
Yeah, I think that if you look at the Gaza war and you look at the Ukraine war, uh, and by the way, we're putting aside the potential for conflict in the East China Sea, which is quite significant these days. But if you look at Ukraine and you look at Gaza, it's quite clear that we have been in a lot of trouble in Ukraine since February 2022 when the war started, and in Gaza since that conflict started last October 7th. But when you think about sort of where we are today compared to where we were when both of those conflicts started, it seems quite clear that the situation has worsened and the potential for escalation in both cases is quite significant. Moreover, there's no evidence that either one of these conflicts, the Israeli Palestinian conflict or the Ukraine Russia conflict, both of which we're deeply involved in, are going to settle down anytime soon. And indeed, it looks like they're going to get worse over time. And that's why I think, in good part, the potential for escalation is so great in both cases.
Well, let's look first at the Russia Ukraine war, since that's the one that really has the biggest potential negative ramifications. And so, I mean, really, you hit it on the head there when you look at the condition that existed on, say, January 2022, and the one that exists now in that area. By every measure, we are significantly worse off than we were before. Whether you're talking about the casualties on the Ukraine side, the loss of their territory, the diminution of our own infrastructure and the number of weapons and ammunitions that we have to defend ourselves, and then the increase in the Russian capacity, the larger of their armed forces size, their industrial capacity, all of those things. And we could do a lot more. They're a lot worse. But then you have the Secretary of State of the United States saying that, yeah, I know about all those things, but actually our stuff is doing remarkably well.
The bottom line is this. The Ukraine strategy that we've had and that we've been acting on individually and collectively now for nearly 2.5 years is showing effective results in making sure that Ukraine can ward off Russian aggression, and it's done that remarkably. Keep in mind, Putin's objective from day one was to erase Ukraine from the map, to end its existence as an independent country, to subsume it into Russia. That has failed.
Now, in a large measure there, John, I think that there's not a misstatement but an outright lie when he says that Putin's original objective was to take all of Ukraine and to wipe it off the map. So, since there still is a Ukraine on the map, then hence he can say our strategy has worked remarkably well.
Well, it's not a lie if what he is saying is delusional. In other words, if he really believes this, then it's not a lie. It's just delusional. And I think that Tony Blinken, on a number of key dimensions of both the Ukraine conflict and the Gaza conflict, is not lying. He's just delusional. And in a very important way, that's probably worse than lying. But the fact is that Putin was never interested in conquering all of Ukraine. There's no evidence to support that assertion. But more importantly, given where we are today, his comment that Ukraine is doing quite well on the battlefield and it, in effect, has stymied the Russians is simply wrong. If you look at what's happening on the battlefield and even deeper into Ukraine in terms of the military conflict, the Russians are clobbering the Ukrainians. They're killing huge numbers of Ukrainian soldiers up on the front lines. They're making slow progress on the ground for sure in terms of capturing territory. But as you and I both know, that's not what really matters here. What matters is the casualty exchange ratio. And the casualty exchange ratio decisively favors the Russians at this point in time, who have more manpower to begin with. Furthermore, when you look at what the Russians are doing with their air power, the amount of destruction that they're creating with regard to, for example, the Ukrainian energy grid, it's quite stunning. They've brought down enough of that grid that half of Ukraine's electricity is no more. And in many places in Ukraine, they are not getting any electricity for 10 hours a day. And if anything, this situation is going to deteriorate in the months ahead as the Russians continue to target the grid. And then when the fall and especially the winter come, it's going to be really horrible for the Ukrainian population. And by the way, when you bring down the grid, it not only does immense damage to the civilian population, it has all sorts of consequences for your industry and for your military. So the idea that Ukraine is doing well and we're helping them to stabilize the situation is delusional. It's just another example of Tony Blinken and the Biden administration more generally making comments that make no sense. Ukraine is in deep trouble, and we are in deep trouble.
Now, and let's look at some of that a little bit further. The U.S., one would again just conceptually believe that the State Department and the administration would be saying, okay, get in their little think tank room there and say, what can we do to lower the risk of this war escalating, to lower the risk of that anything bad happens to us, and maybe get this off the table so that we can start the process of rebuilding and rebuilding strength and rebuilding our own inventories. That would seem like what would be job number one. But instead, we don't see any of that so far. We see just delusions or whatever. They keep saying stuff like this and then no change on our policies. How can that be? And if you have any idea at all what is might be going on in their minds that they think that this somehow could lead to something good, I just don't see it. Do you?
Well, the truth is, we, meaning the West, and especially the United States, are committed to doubling down. And you saw this at the recent G7 meeting that took place in Italy in mid June. Uh, what we did, and again, I'm talking about the West, but mainly the United States, was we reinforced our commitment to Ukraine. We supplied them with $50 billion. We increased the sanctions on Russia. And very importantly, the United States consummated a 10-year security agreement with Ukraine. And both President Zelensky of Ukraine, and Secretary of State Blinken said that this was, quote unquote, a bridge to bringing Ukraine into NATO. From a Russian point of view, this is, completely unacceptable. It's like waving a red flag in front of a bull, as we used to say when I was a kid. It's just asking for trouble. So all this is to say, Danny, that we are doubling down on our commitment to Ukraine. We are more invested than ever. And at the same time, the situation on the battlefield, the situation on the Ukrainian side of this conflict is deteriorating at a rapid pace. And that means there's going to be, at some point, significant pressure on the United States and on the West more generally to escalate, to rescue the situation, given that we are so profoundly committed to Ukraine's plight. So
Well,
this is
and in
very
fact,
worrisome situation.